Hello and good morning. Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday. I'm Dr. Selma Bartholomew, a partner with Legacy. Thank you so much for connecting with us today for our segment of Legacy Ed News. I am looking forward to having a conversation today with Dr. Richard Bell, renowned author and speaker. And as always, we thank you for making time for us and for connecting with us in our work that we do in education. This is actually a three-part discussion that we've been having on criminal justice reform and looking and tackling at the hard issues and also at the solutions. We always like to give some updates first in terms of what's happening in the news. So for example, in New York City this week on Monday, our elementary students resumed in-person learning. And that was for those parents who had chosen in-person learning and would most likely have some blended version of a schedule. And so now those students are in the buildings. And this is important because when we closed schools in New York, we had several parents who signed protest letters and noted that they were not consulted in the plan around the numbers and the plan for when to open and close schools. We also want to share that in Dayton, Ohio, that there's no school, there's no in-person and there's no virtual, as a result of the large number of teachers who are out sick and administrators who have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we are looking hopefully in the next week or two to have an expert from Dayton on with us and to give them the opportunity to share what is happening in Dayton. And finally, as everyone knows, we're all on kind of keeping our breath as we now are rolling out a vaccine and some promise of being able to have relief from the pandemic. And a vaccine is not necessarily treatment. And so there are also some research being done in Rutgers University around the actual treatment of the disease. So we look forward to also sharing that with you in the next few weeks. So now to our exciting conversation. I'm honored to have Dr. Richard Bell, and he is a historian, author, and just released a new book, Stolen: 5 Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Journey Home. And I'm going to let Dr. Bell introduce himself, but let me give a context for this discussion. I know we've been talking about current, present day criminal justice reform, but we also have to look at what are the things and what's the mindset and the culture that has led us to this point so that we truly understand the nature of it, so we can now make some more informed decisions. And as you know, when we work with schools, this is also an important book in the context of culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy that not just Black and Brown children need access to, but all children in our nation needs access to. So Dr. Bell, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. B. It's a pleasure.
So tell us about, before you tell us about the book, I am curious about what led you to the idea of the book. You know, what were some of the breadcrumbs that you might have seen as a historian, as an author, that made you curious about this? Because I had never heard of this story. So I'm going to give you a chance as to if you can share that first.
Yeah, no, I'm sure we'll talk about the connections between past and present a bit further into the conversation, but let's begin with the past here, because this is a history book. This is a true story about something that happened in a great American city, Philadelphia, actually, in 1825. And let me be clear right away that similar things to what I'm about to describe happened everywhere else as well, meaning New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, you name a northern city in the decades before the Civil War, and things happened there very similar to what I'm about to describe. And what my book Stolen is about is the kidnapping of 5 free African-American boys into slavery by a gang of kidnappers, child snatchers. We would call them human traffickers, right? Who specialized in turning free Black children into Southern slaves. They would grab them anywhere they could, from free soil in northern states where slavery was dead or dying, and transport them vast distances, crossing into the slave states, looking for buyers, plantation owners who wanted to buy more Black people to pick cotton and sugar, but who didn't want to pay big city New Orleans slave prices, for instance, and were willing to buy people they probably suspected or knew to be kidnapped free people from northern states to do that work. And your viewers may be familiar with the Oscar-winning movie 12 Years a Slave, which came out 2 years ago. A terrific, important movie that I think many people should see. That tells the true story of an adult man to whom this happened. His name was Solomon Northup. He was in his mid-30s when he was kidnapped and trafficked into slavery. And he's one of the few free Black people who were enslaved who eventually escaped that enslavement. It took him 12 years to do it, you remember, 12 years a slave. But it turns out that what happened to Solomon Northup happened to thousands, if not tens of thousands of other free Black Americans between the Revolution and the Civil War. And a great many of them were children, juveniles, young people, adolescents or younger. In my book, I tell the true story of these 5 boys, the oldest of whom was 15, the youngest of whom was 8. They were kidnapped, snatched, trafficked into slavery in Mississippi and Alabama. And then what's surprising about this story, given all the obstacles in their path, Dr. B, some, but not all of them, are able to escape, able to fight for their freedom, able to make what my book calls an astonishing odyssey home, back to Philadelphia, where they blow the whistle on their kidnappers. So it's a reminder, just as a headline here, that threats to Black freedom have been around for a very long time in the United States. We know that slavery is the greatest threat to Black freedom in this period. And you can live on free soil. You can even have freedom papers and still not be fully free. Your freedom can be snatched from you at any time.
I think what I so appreciate that. And I think that it's, first of all, the fact that it is a true story and that it is a story represented of, I think, tens of thousands of individuals. And it speaks to freedom, right? Everyone is talking about equity today, but to me, the conversation really has to be about freedom and the mindset of freedom. So I want to go to that space. Here they are in Philadelphia, and that is supposed to be a place where you are allowed to be free as a Black male, as a Black woman, as a child, right? So they were also taking, to take children. And what is the culture that facilitated that, right? That this idea of kind of like the criminalization of Black and brown people in this country. Because when you say they were transported from Philadelphia to Alabama, there's no Amtrak. There's no plane. And so the physical piece to me in terms of, well, how did they get them there? Were they shipped there? So if you can maybe give a little bit more of a context of just, they're in Philadelphia, now they've got to get them south. And yes, they're kidnapped. And so their children, they're afraid. And also in their mind, they must have thought, I'm free, right? I'm in this place and I'm walking around, and to be snatched and to be kidnapped. So I want to get a context for people to truly understand that in that time period, what did it actually mean to ship these and to move these boys across lines, and the fact that it was that their kidnappers were not arrested. And so what is that culture, and what's the experience of first the boys? So I guess that's the first question. What was their experience? How did they get them from point A all the way to Louisiana?
So let's start with that. So I used one word, transport. You used the word ship. It means the same thing, right? But that covers a massive amount of actual human experience, right? What is the experience of being transported over a vast distance? If you think about where Philadelphia is on a map of the United States, and you think about where somewhere like New Orleans or Natchez or Baton Rouge is down in the Deep South, we know these are vast distances. Even if you were on Amtrak, this would take you a couple of very slow days. So it's a journey of about 1,200 miles, by the way. This continent of ours is enormous. And they are being made primarily to walk on their feet. So I counted the steps, Dr. B. This is a journey of about 2 million children's footsteps from point A to point B.
And I want to make the math clear to people. So 1 mile, for those listening, is 5,280 feet, okay? And it's important that people have that context, right? Like we don't necessarily, when we think we're losing weight and I'm walking a mile. So they literally walked, you're saying 1,200 miles from New York, from Philadelphia to the south. Wow.
Right, and they didn't take a direct route necessarily because there aren't, interstate highways. They're trying to stay, their captors are trying to make sure they stay off certain roads and stay relatively low profile. So the weather changes around them, etc. These are climates and geographies these children aged 8 to 15 have never been to before. You can think of all the physical and psychological dimensions of that odyssey into uncertainty and fear that must go with a journey like that. And of course, their captors are malevolent actors, bad actors, right? They're heavily armed. They're not scared about using the threat of violence. The last thing they want to do is have these children rise up or run away, because that would be a loss of this particular human asset, the way they see these children as property, having enslaved them. So this is a terrifying experience in every way. And in the book, I spend a lot of time, as you can imagine, reconstructing that awful journey before turning to the important question of how these children then tried to break free of that form of incarceration, because slavery is a type of incarceration among many other things as well. But to scroll back to the first thing you said, how did this happen? How did people like this get away with it, right? It's an unfathomable question, because remember, Philadelphia in 1825 is a free city with free soil in a free state. Slavery is not there anymore in any meaningful way. Most of these people in this story are legally free. So how could it be permitted, and by whom, that Black children going about their business can be snatched away and taken, as I said, 1,200 miles, 2 million steps away from their parents, their loved ones. And
the mindset, right? And the culture that is facilitating that. And I think that is the word for me. It is about, it's freedom, because you can say I'm free. However, if there's a blind eye, and if there is this idea of this continued mindset that that Black people are property, and this concept of being free is truly not, right, something that we see available and accessible, and opportunity of freedom for Blacks, then it's okay for people, and I'm not saying it's everyone, it's that culture, which I think fuels and continues, and I know fuels the criminalization that we are experiencing today, right? That it's okay, because when you're in jail and you're in prison, you're not free. And when you don't have those access and those opportunities, and this is where the pipeline leads you, to me, it's the same mindset. So what did you find by way of what is happening in Philadelphia at that time? Are people aware of it, and are they concerned about this human trafficking of Blacks back into slavery, into the South?
Yeah, so these are exactly the right questions, right? And one of the things I discovered was that this idea we carry around with us in our heads of the evil South and the good North, the slave South and the free North, part of that doesn't really hold up to too much scrutiny, right? So there are the climate of racial control, racial subordination, racial discrimination on free soil in the free North is actually pretty toxic, right? So the word they used to use, this is an 1840s word, is negrophobia, fear of Black people. Which means that you could be a white person living in Philadelphia and pleased with yourself on some level that your state is no longer a slave state. But that doesn't mean you want to give a job, if you're an employer, to an African-American man. It does not mean you want your daughter to marry a person of color. It does not mean that you're going to make places available in school or in your church or in the labor market or housing, who you're going to rent a room to. All these forms of slightly less explicit discrimination than slavery are nonetheless crippling if you're trying to carve out a life as a free Black person in these places. So it's that climate, Dr. B, of intolerance, and when it comes to kidnapping, awareness but lack of concern,
Right.
permits kidnappers to come in from nearby slave states, grab your children, grab free black children, and spirit them away. And if white witnesses see those things happening, which we know they did, the chances that they're going to rush over to stop it are actually terrifyingly small. Now, to be clear, there are some white Quaker activists who are actively concerned about kidnapping, but they are small in number, poorly resourced. And the free black community, which is large in number, is also poorly resourced. And of course, almost by definition, does not have much political or social power at this time. So there are hard limits as to what free black people, especially parents, can do to protect their own children in this climate of racial intolerance and indifference to the threats to black freedom in the North.
I think what is interesting today is as I make the parallel, I like the back and forth where, okay, you're taking us to history. I'm very mindful of Benjamin Banneker's First Freedom Letter, where he talks about this, this view of the African man, right, of not having the mental prowess and not having the mental ability. And he's urging Jefferson to to make a case that the British treatment of whites and British and them moving to this new land, and that Africans are also being treated the same way. And so how can you talk about the British being your oppressors, and now you've also decided to oppress the African enslaved? I do think that part of this criminalization piece, that we're in a time right now where we are having the language of defund the police, and we are quite aware, because the world went on pause as we saw the murder of Mr. George Floyd. He was not the first, and certainly, sadly, when you turn on the news and you see individuals who are committing suicide in prison, all of these things just speak, to the mindset. And I am a mom, and the data really says if I had two sons, one of them may not come home. Right? One of them may end up in the prison system. And so while we stand by. So I think what I want to get to is the question of, as you look at this historical piece around freedom, what do you see it today? What would you, if we had to think about what freedom meant today, and are we necessarily, are people turning a blind eye? Are we, okay with this when we look at the criminal justice system? Any parallels in terms of where we were in the 1800s and today in the context of understanding freedom?
Yeah, of course. I mean, absolutely, there are parallels and echoes. Now, I want to state for the record that as an historian, I don't think that history repeats itself. I don't think we're going around in the same hamster wheel. But I do think history rhymes. I do think history echoes across the ages. And I do think the way we live now is fundamentally informed by how we lived before. The past seeps into the present in all sorts of ways, both good and bad, as you pointed out. So just to take this at a very basic level, if we think of the end of slavery as a watershed moment in American history, which it was, and remember, it cost 750,000 lives in the Civil War to destroy American slavery and ratify that in the 13th Amendment. That's a big deal. But I think too often, those of us in the United States, and I'm, by the way, a citizen of the United States, despite my British accent, those of us in the United States, I think, often think that the job of destroying white supremacy and racism was accomplished easily, not easily, but finally, yes, by Abraham Lincoln, for instance, in 1865. Not only does that write off all the actual ordinary Americans, black and white, slave and free, who made sure that slavery died on the ground and died 1,000 deaths, not just Lincoln, it writes off all the insidious ways that racism and white supremacy have found other manifestations since the death of slavery. Now, your viewers out there will be well familiar with things like Jim Crow and sharecropping and segregation, separate but equal. But we'd also, I think you and I might be more likely to also carry on that conversation and say, well, look at the war on drugs, look at mass incarceration, look at the defunding of public education over the last 50 years. These things which are not overtly racial, are implicitly forms of racial control. They've wrought racial effects on the ability of non-white people, people who don't look like me, to succeed in this country, to thrive, right? And the juvenile justice system is unfortunately a sad example of that, right? We all know that, I think I've got some stats in front of me, we lock up 300 young people out of every 100,000 young people in this country. The rate of juvenile incarceration here is more than 4 times higher than that found in our closest rival for that dubious distinction, South Africa. And it's not because crime rates among young people are any higher here than they are elsewhere. It's because we lock up more people, and those people tend to be non-white for lots of different reasons. We pour massive amounts of taxpayer money into the juvenile carceral system. The number I have is something like $88,000 per person to keep a juvenile inmate incarcerated. And you and I both know we could provide wonderful public education or community college and other forms for far less. But where we put our where we put our dollars tells us a lot about our priorities as a politics, as a polity in this country. So there's a lot of room for growth.
And I think I'm going back to your book, because I think it is fundamental in mindset and beliefs. And I'm making that connection again to Banneker. I don't think that people truly want to believe that Black and brown children, can do the math, can do the reading, can do these things, right? And so it's so much easier to have that mindset and that fear of Black children, and to continue to fuel that pipeline system. And I know when you made the analogy of saying, here are these 5 boys being stolen on the streets of Philadelphia, that yes, there are lots of Black people around who see this, but they don't have the resources. And I think on the parallel today is, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm always fighting that they have intentionally locked Black businesses and out of opportunity to be able to truly create community and to have that economic impact on our children. Because if you can't get a summer job, then where do you end up? If you can't get someone to mentor you, what are the opportunities? And so it is all very much linked. We cannot just be in this very moment and think that this just happened. This has been fueled, and we have to know the past, which is why I'm so excited about your book, to be able to truly understand that mindset of the criminalization of our children. And you talk about 5 boys. I don't know, in your history, as a historian, as you were looking through the archives, I'm pretty sure that there were also young girls as well. I don't think that they were discriminatory and say, oh, I only see a Black boy, and right? Am I correct about that, that analogy?
You're absolutely right. So my book focuses on one particular kidnapping case where the 5 people snatched are all boys. But my research, 10 years of research for this book, Dr. B, makes it very clear that young Black girls, females, were also in high demand in the Deep South, whether they were legally bought and sold into Louisiana from other plantations, or whether they were kidnapped from the free streets of New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, etc. Folks who will remember the movie 12 Years a Slave will remember that the character of Patsy, played by Lupita Nyong'o, the amazing British, I think, Kenyan actress, she was a real person. Patsy was a real person. Patsy was not kidnapped. Patsy was born on someone else's plantation, but she comes to the plantation that Northup finds himself on, and quickly becomes the most valuable human asset that this awful plantation owner, Epps, possesses. And let me be clear, Dr. B, she is 13 when she comes to that plantation, and she's valuable because cotton picking does not require massive brute strength or the ability to bench press 200 pounds. What it requires is stamina, and it requires dexterity. And teenagers, boys and girls, possess that in great amounts, and so were a target of kidnappers on the front end, as well as legal slave traders. And of course, I don't want to get too graphic here, but we're all well aware that when we're talking about young girls in particular in slavery, there's always the threat of sexual assault and sexual violence looming over all of this as well.
Absolutely. And I'm mindful of the time, Dr. Bell. I want to be able, for those audience who are just joining us, thank you so much. This is our LegacyED News. Please make sure and like and subscribe. I think also this piece that I want to also connect back to is, where do we go from here? What is the agenda that we now need to be advocating for? So I want to make sure we tell people where to get your book. Right, it's great reading. It's a great gift for the holiday season. And I want to make the connection of where do we go from here? Because in our work in education, there is this language around culturally relevant curriculum and culturally relevant pedagogy. And for us as a company and my team, we fight because we know it means that the massive, textbook companies, they'll put some faces in there, and people will think, oh, I put a face of Frederick Douglass in there. And so hence it's a culturally relevant curriculum. But for me, it's having our children get access and opportunity to these kinds of works and to this kind of thinking, because historical thinking skills requires a habit of mind of making inferences and making predictions, right? You might know fact 1, fact 2, fact 5, but our children need, all of us, not just Black children, all of us in this country, we need a better sense of those historical thinking skills. And so for me, where I would like to think about in the future is certainly a more culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy. And yesterday on one of our webinars, Mr. Molina, Deputy Commissioner Molina, was talking about standards for policing and standards across the country for juvenile justice. And so do you see, when you look to the future, as you think about your work as a historian and the body of work that you've done around slavery, and in this case now adding to that body of work, where do you think we go from here?
Yeah. Okay. So let me begin with the book, and then land exactly where you are now. So just a reminder to folks that this book, Stolen, is available in all the usual places. You can find it anywhere you normally get books, including Amazon and your local library. There's also a wonderful audio book of this read by a New York actor, Leon Nixon, by the way, not me. And it's available in paperback and hardback. There's also a teacher's guide. If there are teachers out there who'd like to ever consider teaching this book, I can send you a 18-page teacher guide I wrote for this. And in fact, if you want to be in contact with me, you can just Google my name, which is Richard Bell at Maryland, University of Maryland, and my pages will pop up right away, including my email address. I encourage people watching this to reach out to me. So the thought I'd like to leave you with, Dr. B, is that while there is so much work to do on all these issues you're raising and advocating for in your own career, and while we are living through a period where I see renewed activism and optimism around the ability to move this forward, I want to say that we can also draw inspiration from the generations that have come before this, that have tried to, fight the freedom struggle in their own time and in their own ways. And their concerns were different from ours, because history does not repeat itself. But we have seen ordinary Americans at every moment since 1619 up through the Civil War and beyond the Civil War, fighting for racial justice and equality, to push our politicians and our elected officials to do better at every turn. And so much that's been achieved has been down to the work not of some president or general, but because of the extraordinary efforts of ordinary people in their communities to push that ball forward and create pressure on people who have large reservoirs of political power. So we do have that power in all of us. The death of slavery is the greatest example of that, but by far the only one. So I draw huge inspiration from watching the Black parents of the 5 boys kidnapped in this book, from the 5 boys themselves who are doing everything to claw back their freedom and make that meaningful again, from their very few white allies in this period. And I wish they had more doing this work as well. And I think it behooves all of us, when it comes to the education piece, to whether we're students or parents, to be super aware, super engaged with things like the curriculum. I have a 4-year-old, I have a 7-year-old. I'm an historian, so you bet I'm going to be paying close attention when those textbooks start coming home as to what those textbooks consist of. It matters who's on your school board. You should make sure your school board in your community looks like your community, not different to your community. And if it doesn't look like you, then fix that
Yes.
by running, right? So in all these ways, I think ordinary people, students, parents, community members can make an extraordinary difference. That's the only way we push the ball forward in this country. It's not by apathy and indifference. It's not by waiting for someone else to come along and fix this. Only we can fix this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I so appreciated you sharing your expertise, your experience. The book, for those in our audience, please make sure and get a copy of Stolen. It's a great gift and an opportunity to learn. And I'm in full agreement about the fact that we do have the ability to create the change. And my hand is in your hand. And together we can make a difference and move forward. I'm also thankful for the shift in mindset. Yes, I know in our education space, we talk about equity, but I think we should talk about freedom. I think that if we do freedom, it is inextricably linked to the past and to the present, and it will now also help people to understand that the mindset that we need in order to shift policy and shift the things that we need in order to create a true one nation and not these divided spaces and places. I'm honored, and I thank you again for making time for us and for sharing your expertise. And for those who are watching, please make sure you like and subscribe. Connect with us again on our LegacyED News and also on our Community Conversations with Leaders webinar. And I invite people back on December 16th. We're doing our virtual holiday celebration with poet Cynthia Amoa. And we're also going to be recognizing some young entrepreneurs and young scholars on that event as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Bell. And thank you to our audience.
Thank you.